June 25, 1944, just after 0430, hedgerow country east of St. Lo. Damp mist clung to the bocage, and the bunker the engineers called der Unzerstörbare sweated lime and oil, its 12-foot roof pressed under a skin of Norman clay. Inside, carbide lamps hissed, wet wool steamed, and the air tasted of cement dust and cordite ghosts from the night's artillery that had done nothing. Then came a shriek no one recognized, a ripping metallic howl that seemed to shear the morning in two. A veteran sapper later wrote that the floor shuddered like a barge striking a pier, and in the next breath, the roof bulged. Gravel rained from seams, and a breath of cold earth rushed through hairline cracks that had never existed. Men staggered to the entrance, braced for the drone of fortresses, but the sky offered only pale light and white scratches slashing downward from somewhere beyond the hedgerows. No pattern of stick bombs, no whistle of falling shells, just sudden, instantaneous thunder that hit before the sound finished forming. The survivors spoke of a Raketenschlag, a rocket blow, the kind of shock you feel in your ribs. Later reports would call them 4.5-inch Allied barrage rockets, M8s, each roughly 40 pounds with a 2-kilogram high-explosive head, loosed by the dozen from truck-mounted launchers more than 2 miles away. They were not precise, but in salvos they were an argument the concrete finally lost. Joints split, equipment toppled, and confidence, once measured in rebar thickness, went with it. By mid-morning, word traveled along Feldwebel whispers that something new had come to Normandy, and the men began asking where such rockets had been forged and who had brought them ashore. The answer lies with the units that dragged these launchers off the beaches and into the hedgerows. By the summer of 1943, the German war machine had turned its faith into concrete. Across the coasts of Europe, from the windswept beaches of Norway to the rocky coves of Brittany, the Reich's engineers poured more than 17 million cubic meters of reinforced stone into the dream of permanence they called Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. To Berlin, it was more than a defense system. It was ideology cast in cement. The Atlantic Wall bristled with gun emplacements built by the Todt organization, each bunker calculated to withstand a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb. The U-boat pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Palisse rose like mountains, their roofs layered with up to 20 feet of steel-reinforced concrete. Even naval fire could scarcely chip them. Inside these monoliths, 88mm guns waited behind embrasures, rangefinders gleamed, and radar masts turned slowly in the salt wind. The sound of generators echoed down corridors lined with tar and sweat, and for the soldiers manning them, the cold walls promised safety, an illusion of eternity amid a collapsing front. Hitler himself believed these structures would halt any invasion. He saw concrete as destiny, the unyielding material expression of the Third Reich's will. When General Erwin Rommel toured the French coastline in late 1943, he declared that not even a fly shall pass. And yet the faith was already cracking. Allied reconnaissance planes flew daily over the coast, mapping every contour. British and American intelligence officers pored over captured blueprints, studying the angles of ventilation shafts and weak points in roof curvature. Tests at Farnborough revealed that even massive bombs scattered too widely to fracture such thickness. The answer, some whispered, would not come from heavier loads but from faster ones, from the physics of concentrated energy, of velocity magnified into destruction. In secret laboratories from Farnborough to Aberdeen, men in white coats began speaking of new equations, of explosive force no longer measured in weight but in speed. And as the Allies prepared their next move, Fortress Europe's faith in immovable concrete would soon meet a weapon designed to move faster than belief itself. Began far from any front line, in sterile workshops lit by the pale glow of test lamps during 1942. British engineers at the Ministry of Supply, joined by counterparts at the U.S. Aberdeen Proving Ground, were chasing an idea born of frustration. Artillery had reached its limit. Even the mighty 155 mm Long Tom could hurl a shell only 25 kilometers, its range chained by barrel wear and recoil physics. But if thrust could be generated without a gun, if flight itself became the weapon, then distance and firepower could be redefined. The British called it the RP-3, the rocket projectile 3-inch. Using a cordite-filled steel tube and simple fins, it could carry a 60-pound warhead at more than 1/100 feet per second, striking targets with both explosive shock and raw kinetic force. The Americans soon took the idea further. Their T34 Calliope mounted more than 60 rockets in racks above Sherman turrets, turning a tank into a rolling battery of flame and thunder. Infantry followed with the land Mattress system, a truck-towed launcher that could unleash 48 rockets in under a minute. No recoil, no breech maintenance, no lumbering gun carriages, just portable, repeatable destruction. Trials on Salisbury Plain in late 1943 astonished observers. Bunkers with 6-foot-thick walls cracked open. The concrete peeled in layers under the focused blast. Engineers realized that for the first time, infantry could bring down fortifications without summoning heavy bombers or naval guns. The equations of warfare were shifting, from pressure and mass to speed and energy. The rocket had left the laboratory and entered the arsenal, promising to tear through the legend of invincibility that Hitler's engineers had built from stone. Dawn. June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, the sea burned with light. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and diesel, and the gray horizon was alive with the sound of engines and the echo of something new. From the decks of British LCTR craft, landing craft, tank, rocket, rows of tubular racks tilted toward the French coast. Each vessel carried over 1,000 RP-3 rockets, their warheads packed with 60 pounds of high explosive. At 06:00, as the first waves of landing craft churned toward the beaches, the order came. In less than a minute, the sky turned into a single sheet of flame. 25,000 rockets screamed toward shore, trailing fire like steel comets. Striking the bluffs above Omaha and the strong points at Pointe du Hoc. German defenders, stunned inside their bunkers, could only describe what followed as an instant hurricane. The first impacts shattered rangefinders and collapsed periscopes. The second ripped open concrete faces that no naval gun had breached in years of war. A Luftwaffe observer near Grand Camp-les-Bains radioed reports of unknown flaming projectiles, traveling too fast to plot, vanishing into the cliffs before radar could react. By the time the echoes died, the air was thick with lime dust and the sharp scent of ozone from detonations. Concrete, once the symbol of permanence, was now reduced to rubble and twisted rebar captured. Wehrmacht soldiers later spoke of walls that bent like cloth, and a lightning storm that came from the sea. In that first hour of Operation Neptune, the myth of the Atlantic Wall fractured as surely as its bunkers. The Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches found not the unbreakable fortress their commanders had feared, but smoking ruins and dazed survivors. Yet for Allied scientists, this was only the prelude, a glimpse of what rockets could achieve once unleashed inland, against the heart of Fortress Europe itself. By the middle of June 1944, as the battles around Cherbourg and Caen raged, German field intelligence began forwarding reports that unsettled even hardened analysts. The 352nd Infantry Division, fighting along the Cotentin Peninsula, described Salven von selbstbewegten Feuerröhren, salvos of self-propelled fire tubes that seemed to come in waves without the telltale thunder of artillery. At first, local commanders assumed they were facing phosphorus bombs or perhaps naval mortars, but the damage patterns made no sense. Craters were wide yet shallow. Concrete pillboxes had their roofs lifted cleanly away, and steel doors were ripped from hinges by overpressure rather than penetration. Messages reached the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht within days, prompting an urgent technical investigation. Shell fragments and twisted fins recovered from the Normandy. Coast were rushed to Peenemünde, the same Baltic testing ground, where the Reich had birthed its own rocket dreams. There, engineers accustomed to studying the V-2's majestic flight examined these small, crude remains from the Western Front. The conclusion was humiliating. The Allies had developed and fielded a family of short-range rockets with lethal precision and simplicity. Primitive but ingenious, one report summarized, noting that the British and Americans had bypassed the complexity of German systems by accepting inaccuracy in exchange for saturation. The irony stung. Germany had pioneered the Nebelwerfer and the supersonic V-2, yet it was now their enemies who had mastered the battlefield use of propulsion to shatter fortifications. Rumors spread among coastal garrisons that the Allies had somehow stolen Peenemünde secrets, a convenient fiction to explain what soldiers could not accept, that the enemy had simply outpaced them. Bunker crews began layering sandbags over concrete domes, welding steel rails as makeshift armor. It changed nothing. Each new rocket barrage was a reminder that the Reich's faith in science and cement had been turned against itself, and that the sound of rushing wind above no longer meant safety, it meant judgment. By August 1944, the lesson of Normandy had hardened into doctrine. What began as an experiment on Invasion Day was now a cornerstone of Allied firepower. Orders from London and Washington called for the rapid expansion of rocket artillery across every front in northwest Europe. The British land mattress, originally conceived as a naval barrage weapon, was re-engineered for the battlefield. Mounted on simple steel frames and towed by trucks, each launcher could fire 32 rockets in under 20 seconds, blanketing 400 yards of terrain with a storm of fire and steel. The roar was described as a horizontal thunder, the ground shaking under the recoil-free release. When Canadian forces deployed them near Breskens and Antwerp during the Battle of the Scheldt in October, the effect was catastrophic. Entire German positions vanished beneath flame and flying concrete dust before the infantry even advanced. Across the lines, American troops adopted their own version. The T34 Calliope, bolted to the turrets of M4 Sherman tanks, gave armored divisions a mobile rocket battery that could annihilate ambush points and forest defenses. A single Calliope salvo, 60 rockets fired in 12 seconds, turned wooded slopes into roaring infernos. From Detroit's industrial corridors to Leeds foundries, production surged. Each 5-inch rocket required only a fraction of the steel and powder of a conventional artillery shell, making them fast to build, easy to transport, and devastating to use. German observers watching from shattered observation posts spoke of walls of fire creeping toward them, unstoppable, mechanical, and merciless. The rocket had made the idea of fixed defense obsolete. The once proud fortress doctrine that had girded the Atlantic Wall and the Siegfried Line alike began to crumble, replaced by the grim realization that no thickness of concrete could stop a storm born of speed. By 1944, as the Allied armies advanced inland, rockets and artillery had shattered most surface defenses, but the great concrete beasts of the Reich still stood. The submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and Bordeaux, their roofs 20 feet thick, mocked every bombardment. The V-3 cannon bunkers carved into the chalk of Mimoyekes seemed beyond reach, immune even to 2,000-pound ordnance. The solution would come not from the battlefield, but from a quiet English workshop, and a man already known for defying physics. Barnes Wallis, the engineer behind the famous bouncing bomb that had crippled the Ruhr dams, turned his attention to a new challenge: how to smash what no weapon could penetrate. His answer was elegant and brutal: the Tallboy. Weighing 12,000 pounds and shaped like a giant bullet, it was designed to fall supersonically, not to explode on impact, but to strike with the concentrated energy of a meteorite. Dropped from a modified Avro Lancaster at 20,000 feet, the Tallboy hit at nearly 750 miles per hour, burying itself deep beneath concrete before detonating. The result was a miniature earthquake. Pen roofs buckled, entire chambers imploded, and pressure waves shattered foundations that had once seemed eternal. When that proved successful, Wallis went further, creating the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the largest conventional bomb of the war, a weapon so heavy that only specially strengthened Lancasters could carry it. But the final evolution came with a hybrid creation, the Disney rocket-assisted bomb. Developed in early 1945, equipped with a rocket motor that ignited seconds before impact, It multiplied its velocity and smashed through layers of reinforced concrete before erupting below ground. On March 10, 1945, a Disney struck the Farge U-boat pens near Bremen, piercing the roof and leaving a 50-foot crater. Hundreds died instantly. German engineers who surveyed the site called the event physically impossible. The age of the fortress had ended, not with artillery, but with mathematics and speed. The Allies no longer aimed at bunkers. They aimed through them. Inside the bunkers of Fortress Europe, the terror was unlike anything the men had imagined. Reports from surviving garrisons at Calais and Boulogne describe scenes that bordered on madness. When the rocket and deep penetration bombardments began, the first sensation was not sound, but pressure. A wave that crushed the lungs and made the skin crawl before the ceiling even cracked. Men clutched their helmets and screamed against the vacuum. Others vomited from the concussive shock. Those sealed behind blast doors found no refuge. The blasts consumed oxygen in seconds, leaving entire chambers gasping in suffocating silence. Medics later recorded cases of auditory collapse, where eardrums ruptured not from shrapnel, but from pressure inversion. Inside the skull, letters recovered from the ruins told of soldiers begging to be reassigned to open field. Units, better to face a tank, one corporal wrote, than to die buried alive. Allied intelligence interrogations confirmed the trauma. Prisoners taken from collapsed fortifications often trembled uncontrollably and refused to re-enter bunkers, even for shelter during transport. What had once been a symbol of invincibility had become a psychological trap, a concrete coffin waiting to be sealed by a single hit. The contrast on the Allied side was equally profound. Infantrymen advancing through shattered fortresses spoke with new confidence, their fear of the dragon's teeth replaced by faith in the thunder above. "We no longer feared the dragon's teeth," one British sapper told a war correspondent. "They crumble like bread." Engineers who had once measured targets in tons of explosives now measured morale, how fear could be inverted, how the mere presence of rocket or bomb could dissolve the enemy's will to resist. Yet even among Allied commanders there was an unease. The weapons that had erased the myth of invulnerability also erased the very idea of fortification. If concrete could no longer protect men, what future was left for the fortress itself? Behind every successful rocket strike, there was an industrial heart that never slept. By autumn 1944, Allied factories were pouring out ordnance on a scale few in 1939 could imagine. Roughly 3 million rockets a month left plants in Connecticut, Birmingham, and Glasgow, their output synchronized by the combined munitions board to feed multiple theaters simultaneously. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy consumed about 500,000 rockets. In Europe, armies planned assaults confident that resupply would follow. The economics were brutal and simple. A 5-inch rocket required barely 10 pounds of steel, roughly 1/5 the metal of a comparable naval shell, and used cordite-based solid propellants that sat inert until lit. Production lines depended on stamping, riveting, and standardized fusing rather than precision bored barrels. So foundries and propellant plants ran continuous shifts. Flatbed trucks and jeep convoys moved launch frames and munitions. Field crews could emplace a Mattress or Calliope, load racks in the field, and fire within minutes before pulling back to resupply. Forward maintenance was minimal. Replace a rail, check fuses, and the rack was ready again. There was no barrel wear to manage and no heavy cranes to position a gun. That operational ease made saturation fire cheap, repeatable, and tactically flexible. Fuel shortages that crippled mechanized formations mattered less to rocket batteries because solid propellants required no liquid supply chains. Ammunition stocks were palletized, rail-freightable, and pushed forward to makeshift ordnance dumps. German strategic missiles like the V-2 were marvels, but ruinously costly and resource-hungry. A single German rocket consumed industrial capacity the Reich could ill afford. By mass-producing simpler propulsion and warheads, the Allies democratized devastation, power delivered by numbers rather than by singular, prohibitively expensive masterpieces. Ordnance depots, sometimes dug into disused quarries, held forward stocks, while combined munitions board liaison officers balanced allocations day to day. Specialist crews were trained to strip and remount racks in the field, turning captured tractors and trucks into improvised batteries when needed. Next, tactics. March 23, 1945, Wesel, Germany. The Rhine shimmered under moonlight, a silver ribbon guarded by the last defenders of the Reich. To the men of the 116th Panzer Division, the western bank seemed ready. The river itself, deep and swift, was their final ally. Then, just before midnight, the horizon turned white. The rocket age had arrived in full force. Thousands of land mattress launchers and Calliope-equipped Shermans opened fire in unison, the roar blending into a single continuous scream that rolled across the water. Within 10 minutes, more than 25,000 rockets struck the far shore, bursting among trenches and gun pits that had taken months to prepare. British war correspondents later wrote that the sky became a furnace and daylight vanished. The storm of fire pulverized the concrete defenses around Wesel, leaving only scorched foundations. Reports from the 116th Panzer Division claimed 40% losses before the Allied infantry even began crossing. German survivors staggered through the smoke, their radios dead, their command posts nothing but molten wire and fractured steel. Some shouted that the Allies had stolen lightning, convinced they faced a new secret weapon beyond explanation. When dawn rose, the Rhine, the fabled impenetrable barrier, was already breached. Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed on pontoon bridges under the fading glow of burning fortifications. Hours later, the same technology battered the Siegfried Line, smashing the dragon's teeth that once marked Hitler's final defensive dream. Pillboxes crumbled, bunkers imploded, and the myth of Fortress Germany collapsed with them. The weapon that had begun as a laboratory experiment in Britain's quiet workshops had reshaped the course of modern warfare. And as the rocket's trails faded into morning mist, Allied planners began to think beyond the Rhine, to a future where artillery would be obsolete, and war would be written in fire and flight. Rocket warfare's promise came with a dangerous bill. Early systems were inherently imprecise. Fin shapes, launch angles, and subtle wind shifts could send entire salvos wide of their mark, turning an intended suppressive barrage into chaotic devastation. In amphibious operations and river crossings, errant salvos occasionally struck friendly positions or adjacent villages, inflicting casualties among advancing troops and support units and shattering fragile supply dumps. The Calliope's spectacular 60-tube volleys and the Mattress launcher's saturation were tactically brilliant but blunt instruments. Minor miscalculations in elevation or a sudden gust could send rockets spiraling into woods, hamlets, or even one's own forward lines. Mechanical failures added a further layer of danger. Misfires, hangfires, and premature detonations in rails or racks maimed crews and forced abrupt cessations of planned barrages. The weapon's psychological power was double-edged. While their thunder often broke enemy morale, overuse exhausted stocks and left units temporarily blind to counterattacks when ammunition ran low. Staff officers and planners kept detailed logs of incidents where stray salvos damaged supply dumps, wrecked bridges intended for follow-on forces, or caused civilian casualties that complicated occupation duties. Concerns reached the highest echelons. Some commanders, worried about waste and collateral harm, urged restraint. Montgomery, for example, is reported to have cautioned against wanton expenditure of rocket stocks. On the technical side, engineers confronted a roster of clear problems: stabilizing fins to reduce drift, hardening launcher rails against sympathetic detonations, improving fusing to cut hangfires, and training crews to calculate winds and sector arcs with far greater care. Tacticians developed safety sectors and firing grids to minimize fratricide, while logistics officers tracked the surprisingly rapid burn rate of ordnance. Still, the blunt truth remained. Without a means to steer a projectile, rockets were area weapons that traded accuracy for volume. Their limits were as revealing as their victories. Each mishap forced innovation, and the search to tame rocket chaos would drive Allied engineers from crude racks and raw power toward a single question: how to make flight itself carry a brain. The next chapter was the beginning of that answer. By the time the last bombs fell in 1945, Europe's faith in concrete had crumbled to dust. What Hitler had once called the eternal walls of the Reich lay split and hollowed, their rebar skeletons jutting like bones. Allied engineers who entered the ruins of Epernay and Wizerne discovered that even 20-foot-thick roofs, reinforced with steel mesh and granite aggregate, had been torn open by the kinetic violence of deep penetration bombs. Their post-war reports were unambiguous. No practical fortress could survive the weapons now in existence. The age of the immovable bunker was finished, yet from those shattered foundations emerged a new discipline. The same British and American scientists who had built the land Mattress and Tallboy began transferring their wartime lessons into post-war research programs. Across the Atlantic, captured German specialists from Peenemünde, men who had designed the V2, were quietly moved to American soil under Operation Paperclip. In U.S. arsenals and testing ranges, their knowledge merged with Allied advances to produce the first generation of guided missiles. The equations that had once calculated how to crack a bunker were now reworked to lift payloads skyward. Within a decade, the physics of destruction had become the physics of propulsion. The same impulse that once shattered Saint-Nazaire's pens would send satellites into orbit and soon after carry nuclear warheads across continents. Concrete warfare had given birth to the ballistic age. For the men who had huddled beneath collapsing ceilings in 1944, the lesson was personal and final. Unbreakable no longer existed. The fortress, the pillbox, the wall, symbols of permanence for centuries, had been undone not by greater walls, but by speed, mathematics, and human ingenuity. Beneath the rubble of Fortress Europe lay the blueprint for the modern world, a world where power no longer sat behind defenses, but rode on the back of velocity. May 1945. The guns were silent, but the land itself still seemed to hum with memory. Across France and Germany, the relics of Fortress Europe lay open to the rain, cracked bunkers, ruptured gun emplacements, corridors filled with the smell of rust and seaweed. The concrete that once promised immortality had become a grave marker for an idea. German engineers who had once boasted of impregnable design now walked among the ruins, tracing their fingers over fissures their own equations could not account for. They had built eternity, and eternity had lasted less than a decade. Across the channel, Allied soldiers rolled up cables and sealed the crates of their launchers, unaware that they were closing the first chapter of a new era. The weapons they had fired in Normandy and along the Rhine were crude by later standards, but they had proven something profound, that speed and science could do what brute weight never could. In the years that followed, the world would take that lesson skyward. Every missile, every jet, every rocket that touched the edge of space owed something to those smoky beaches where thunder first fell without wings. Today, the bunkers remain, scattered along Europe's coasts, their shattered roofs staring blankly at the sea. Moss covers their scars, but the silence inside them still speaks. It tells of the morning when the unbreakable was broken, and humanity learned that no wall, no empire, no fortress can stand forever against invention. Every wall, in the end, meets its reckoning.